Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on inclusion and shared transport. I'm Alan Benson. I'm an activist and campaigner. I'm chair of Transport for All, the charity that champions the rights of disabled people to travel, and I'm deputy chair at London Travel Watch. And for this, I'm also a wheelchair user. So I'm one of those that are in the typically excluded groups from these kind of services. We are facing really, because we all know, a climate crisis, a financial crisis, and a health crisis. And shared transport, I think, gives us an opportunity to tackle many of these areas. And so this session really is to cover what are the opportunities, what sort of things are we doing, how do we include everybody, particularly the typically excluded groups, and what lessons are there out there that we can learn from and share good practice. So I'm delighted to be joined by some really good speakers. Unfortunately, Jessica Hall has gone down with COVID, so won't be joining us, but I'm sure we can provide a really interesting session without her. And I'm joined by Jonathan Hanson, Robert Open, Ross Williams, and Jess Strangewood. And we will start with some short presentations just to lay out the land, as it were, and then there'll be an opportunity for some questions afterwards. So if you want to put questions into the chat, and we will welcome you onto the stage, the virtual stage, to ask the questions if we get time. So if I can hand the stage over to Jonathan to open the session, please.
Thank you very much, Alan. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to bring up some slides. I will be talking about pretty much everything on the slides, so hopefully there is nothing there that I won't describe. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Hampson. I am the country manager for VIA here in the UK. I'm going to kick off my session by talking about inclusion in the ultimate form of shared transport, which is public transport. And I'm going to get straight into what inclusion means for us. VIA was founded in 2012 with the aim of giving a technology upgrade to public mobility. At the heart of this was a belief in a connected world where everyone has access to compelling, efficient, and affordable shared mobility, and that technology could be a key enabler of this. We just don't think it's good enough that so much of our population is without access to good quality public transport, or in many cases, any public transport at all. If we're going to persuade people out of private cars, if we're to ensure that people can access jobs, if we're to ensure that everyone, regardless of their mobility needs, has access to transport, all of these things require strong public transport that can work for all. So that is our aim, and what we are supporting with a range of solutions around the world and at considerable scale. We're working with over 600 cities, local authorities, and transport operators on a huge range of projects across the mobility spectrum. And I'll come on to give a flavour of some of these a little bit later. Here in the UK, where local transport is unarguably in crisis, we're also starting to reach some scale, and we now have over 29 on-demand bus zones around the country in 17 different authorities. The vast majority of these are providing rural access to public transport, often where there previously had been none. And just to call out two other things on this slide, we have a transport planning and data visualization platform called Phoenix that is helping local authorities plan their transport networks better, and an in-house consulting team that called VIA Strategies that advises local authorities on how they can introduce on-demand into their networks. So I alluded briefly to the geographic inclusion that on-demand bus services can provide as they make public transport accessible to more people. But given our mission was to ensure that everyone has access to compelling, efficient and affordable public transport, inclusion really has to be at the core of everything that we do. And there are many elements to this. Inclusion can be around your level of digital adoption, which is why all of our services around the world offer both phone and app bookings. While the pandemic accelerated digital adoption rates hugely, there will always be differing levels of comfort with using mobile applications. And I think on the topic of inclusion, probably it's this topic that I probably get most questions on, which is, yes, the app is often what gets people's attention, but there will always, and actually in a growing number of cases, actually we see passengers turning to the app when they see the benefits of how they can be self-service. But there will always be a segment of the population that won't feel comfortable using them, and it's really important to provide alternatives. Inclusion could also be around what language you speak, which is why our app is now available in 29 languages, depending on the needs of the partner. The only UK example of this is our Flexi service in Wales, for example, which is available both in English and Welsh, which was certainly a new one for our team. Inclusion could be around whether you have a bank account, which is why, depending on the wishes of our partners, a good number of our services accept cash on board, as well as the ability to pay via credit or debit card. And of course, inclusion can be about disability and ensuring that services can meet the needs of anyone with additional mobility needs. And we've done a lot of work on this area, from the way that our algorithm assigns trip requests so that a vehicle is only assigned that can meet their mobility needs, to our app being developed to meet WCAG standards, to our trip algorithms allowing more boarding and alighting time depending on a passenger's disability, to the ability for certain passengers to receive a door-to-door service when all other passengers receive a corner-to-corner service. So I'm going to go on to give some examples of services where these things are in action. And it's three types of services that. First one is just a regular on-demand bus service. I could have picked any number in the UK, but I've chosen our Tees Flex service, which is delivered in partnership with Stagecoach and Tees Valley Combined Authority. This is a hyper-rural service in the northeast, in an area that had previously had limited to no bus service at all. Championed by the local mayor, for the last 2.5 years, residents have had a bus service that they can effectively hail and that will arrive typically within half an hour and take them where they need to go. And we see in feedback how transformative this has been for that community. From access to vaccination centres, to jobs for young, for old, able-bodied and disabled, they can now do what they need to do via public transport. The second type of service is an assisted transport service that we power in Germany in partnership with the state of Berlin. Berlmobil is Berlin's citywide dial-a-ride scheme, allowing those with additional mobility needs who cannot access the main public transport network to do leisure trips around the city, to visit friends, do their shopping, visit cultural sites, basic things that everyone should be able to do. We launched this service in 2021, providing a very significant upgrade to the passenger experience, introducing new digital booking channels, facilitating on-demand booking, as well as the ability to pre-book up to 2 weeks in advance. And we're seeing growing numbers across Europe now upgrade their assisted transport services. And our experience has certainly been that many previously offered a very, very poor experience to users. In the spring, we launched Paris's citywide dial-a-ride service called PAM. Berlin, I've just mentioned. we provide Oslo's service, and in Luxembourg, we also provide their nationwide assisted transport service. The final public mobility service that we're working with our partners to provide a fundamentally upgraded experience is SEM transport. As we talk to UK authorities, this is a huge pain point and a service under real stress. As well as providing Luxembourg's assisted transport service, we also provide their nationwide SEN service in partnership with the government of Luxembourg. The key objectives of upgrading this service was through technology to provide optimized aggregation, routing and scheduling efficiency, while retaining the absolutely vital personalization required from such a sensitive service, as well as provide significantly enhanced transparency for both passengers and authority alike. A service where students or caregivers, as appropriate, can now see the position of their vehicle so they know when they need to get ready, and where authorities can see exactly the performance of the 30 taxi operators delivering the service. So that's a very brief flavour of just some of the work that VIA is doing to promote inclusion in transport. Quite regularly, it's insinuated that new technology risks exclusion and leaving certain communities behind. I hope what I've highlighted is that it can also be quite the opposite, that technology can also be a huge enabler to creating positive change and increased inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That's absolutely fascinating. I wasn't aware of many of the services in Europe that you're running. I think it's, there's lots of opportunity there, lots of things to learn. I can just so if I can invite Robert up, please, to share with us your perspective.
Thanks very much, Alan. So hopefully you can all see that screen now.
Yeah, we can.
I'll just quickly start by telling you who Co-Wheels is as an organisation, and then go through sort of three areas where we look at social inclusion, digital inclusion, and physical inclusion. So Co-Wheels, for those that aren't aware, we don't operate in London, which is why a lot of people haven't heard of us, but we're a national car club, been going for more than 13 years. Started in Durham in the northeast with just 2 cars. We're a registered social enterprise and community interest company with the express purpose to promote sustainable transport. Sorry, that just spotted that slight typo. There's 600 vehicles, sorry, not 60 vehicles, in more than 50 locations across the UK. And around a third of that fleet is EVs. And 50% are hybrid. So we'd sort of argue that makes it one of the most sustainable national car club fleets in the UK. So switching over to where a lot of inclusion starts for us, which is with the data. There's sort of 2 key areas that we look at when it comes to data. Around socioeconomic data, we use a geographical information system which has mosaic data in it, which includes all of the key socioeconomic groups that use our services, and also shows those that don't. And we also look at IMD data, the indices of multiple deprivation, which a lot of local authorities will be very familiar with in terms of planning services, because it gives data on disadvantaged communities. So in terms of that mosaic data, this is one of the key groups I was going to highlight. They're one of our biggest users. We have 2 main user groups, principally younger people, one of which is on above average incomes, called Metropolitan Living, and this group called Urban Squeeze. It makes up more than 17% of our membership. They tend to have low levels of car ownership. They're on below the national average income. If they do own a car, they tend to have an older, more polluting car, and one that's also much less reliable and more expensive to maintain. They tend to live in social housing or private rented housing, but sometimes they can be found living alongside Metropolitan Living, so it's easy for us to deliver service to both of them. So looking where they are, just as a particular example, I've got a map here on my screen which shows dots for every postcode. This is Newcastle, which is where Co-Wheels is based, our home city, so we're quite familiar. And the red dots indicate every postcode that is Metropolitan Living, and the green dots indicate every postcode that is the urban squeeze group. So in Newcastle, they're a bit more divided than in many cities. They tend to be in the west end of the city, on the left-hand side of that map, and on the right-hand side in Byker. Whereas living in places like Jesmond and slightly more affluent suburbs. And that pretty much coincides with our service delivery of where our cars are located, because we know we use this as part of one of our planning tools to make sure that we can deliver services equally to both of these groups. And when you overlay that with the IMD data, I mean, IMD data, it's split down into all those categories there of mainly weighted in terms of income and employment. So it essentially is those poorest, most deprived communities. But it also, if you look at the other data sets in there, it covers health deprivation, disability, living environment deprivation, i.e. those places that have the least access to green space, the highest levels of pollution, and the poorest environments. And we can split all these layers out, but essentially when you do that, you find that those that are the poorest in terms of income also have the worst in terms of poorest health and the biggest barriers to housing and poorest environment. So again, looking at that same map that I've got on the screen of Newcastle, you can see that those dark areas, this is the dark red areas are the basically the 5% of the population that are in the most deprived. So 95% of the rest of the country is better off than these communities. So this is the 5% slice who are basically have the highest levels of unemployment, poor income, poor health, and poor environment. And as you can see from that map, it shows that it coincides with the green dots, essentially showing that is exactly where that community we've described, the urban squeeze community, lives. And this allows us to have a conversation with local authorities. Apologies. This basically allows us to have a conversation with local authorities, sharing the data with them, making sure that we're addressing their priorities in terms of when they're looking to address deprivation. So if they're looking at things like low traffic neighbourhoods to try and keep traffic out of those sort of areas so they're not suffering from the effects of pollution, they're looking at zero emission zones. We can basically overlay our mapping and show the impact of putting car clubs into those areas to both give those communities access to the benefits of a car when they need one, but also to try and reduce car ownership and therefore the impact of the car on those communities. So moving on to digital inclusion, when we rebranded, obviously we took the opportunity to change what we do in terms of our website, our booking system, and which is online, and our app to make it meet the latest accessibility standards as just as a basic. But as Jonathan picked up there in terms of technology, there are still a lot of people who, although we have smartphone app, would prefer to do it by telephone. And we don't charge for that. We don't see that as even though that is a third of our staff in that telephone support, we don't try and limit access to our members in any way, because obviously if we feel if they're phoning, there's obviously a good reason why they are. So we don't charge for it. We don't put any restrictions on it, and we still get many members who who've joined in the early days who prefer to just still phone up and make their regular weekly booking for their shopping trip by phone. And then looking at other technology that people commonly have with them, smart cards. We've partnered with one of the major bus operators, Go Ahead Group, initially just in Newcastle, with the Flexility partnership to use their smart cards. It's a picture of Go North East bus, one of our cars, with the Flexility card. I must stress that's the real thing is much smaller. And basically that smart card, which can be used to by the bus company to load your money onto it to pay for fares, also gives you automatic membership of free membership of co-wheels, plus additional bonuses, and it acts as your member card to access the cars. So again, you don't have to have a wallet full of cards. And we work quite closely with public transport operators, because we don't see public transport operators as competitors. Really, it's very much a cooperative relationship, because the data shows that if people don't drive a car to work, if their daily commute is by public transport or on foot or on bike, then they're much more likely to be car club members for when they do need a car. So again, we like to work quite closely with public transport operators on joint schemes like that. And then looking at our experience on accessibility, Co-Wheels was a sort of an early pioneer with wheelchair accessible vehicles. And I'm putting this up really as an opportunity to look at our experience, what worked and what didn't work. Because back in 2015, we had 4 fully wheelchair accessible vehicles on our fleet in Scotland, 3 in Aberdeen and 1 in Dundee. We'd put it on there initially because it was a requirement of the tender to have 1 vehicle, but we sort of really tried to make a go of it in terms of building the capacity to try and see what demand we could get for that. And again, I'd say, although it's, I've said at the start there, it starts with data, we probably went into this without the data. Back in 2015, we didn't know what demand there would be. We didn't really have a detailed picture of users to know if there would be sufficient demand. And the first drawback we found, obviously, was that obviously if you're an owner or regular user of a WAV, you're quite familiar with the way it works. But as a car club, you're open to anybody. We had to give special training face-to-face on the hydraulic lift and the winch system so that it can really be safely operated. So again, that was a block. We had to set up a special group, lock those vehicles down to just those who'd been trained. It worked best where one of those vehicles was next to a residential centre for adults with learning disabilities, so that staff, volunteers, carers and relatives who would often use the vehicle to take people on trips and as part of the routine work of the centre. But the other 2 vehicles in Aberdeen were just in the general community, and overall we found utilisation was basically too low to make them fully sustainable. We stuck with them for at least 4 years, but ultimately those vehicles had to be withdrawn because they just weren't sustainable long term. And obviously what we learned really was that we needed to before trying anything like this, to actually assess and map out the market and see if there is that potential demand before just going into it. And so looking at the future, what we've looked at is probably a lot less ambitious, but potentially is more open to being useful to a wider range of people. So one of the first things we're looking at to introduce next year is really getting much better accessibility information on our current vehicles. We've looked at and spoken to groups like the Research Institute for Disabled Consumers, who produce data sheets like this data sheet that I've got on screen here, which lists every individual vehicle with all the dimensions of things like the seating, the doors, the headroom, and information like you see on the right of the screen there about wheelchair. Can it take an unfolded wheelchair in the boot? Can it take a folded wheelchair? Will it fit between the back rows of seats? And we're looking to make this sort of information more readily available alongside the general booking information we provide. We provide information like, is it automatic? How many seats? But we want to make this more visible to all of our users so that it opens up the potential for people to assess before they make a booking, rather than having to ring us to actually see if that vehicle is going to meet their needs. And although we've done this informally in the past, we're looking at formalising our system of nominated drivers, so that if a member with a disability joins, that they can nominate a driver, gets free membership, who can actually drive them without any additional cost. And finally, I think what we're looking, especially after our experience in Aberdeen, is looking for more data from local authorities, from any other sources really, to build a better picture, because we don't have a complete picture of all our users. And looking at that Aberdeen experience, only 1 or 2% of the population are currently regular car sharers. So of that 1 or 2%, the amount that would be wheelchair users could be potentially low. So we need to know, is there a bigger demand beyond the current membership? But one of the things we've discussed with Como UK is, again, is looking at the regular annual survey, and if we can build in additional information in that to build up a fuller picture of our current membership in terms of their needs. And on that, really, it's just that's where we're absolutely open to ideas and over to the conference to come up with anything that we'll always welcome feedback and views as to how we can improve things and what more we could do.
Thank you, Rob. There's an awful lot to unwrap in there. I think there's from my perspective, I'm thinking about how we, and particularly interested in your take on providing information and details about vehicles. And I think I've got a question formulating for later about how we stimulate that demand, which I think is something clearly struggled with. And I'd remind the audience that there will be a Q&A after we've heard all of the presenters speak. So if you've got questions, do please feel free to put them in the chat. And thank you, Rob. And if I can invite Ross to step up now and share with us his thoughts and experiences.
Thank you, Alan. Hopefully my screen is sharing now. So firstly, just to start, thanking Coma UK for inviting me to present today as well. My name is Ross Williams and I'm a senior consultant within the new mobility team at the transport consultancy Steer. My presentation today is around advances in inclusive micro-mobility, which is in reference to a recent project that we have completed for Connected Places Catapult, and I'm going to provide you a flavour of some of the findings from that today. So the project in question was a market scan that sought to provide insights on current innovations in the market addressing accessibility and inclusivity in the micro-mobility sector. The project formed part of a wider package of work that Catapult were doing, which was ultimately feeding into the Department for Transport to help with their regulatory thinking and understanding the challenges, the gaps and user requirements, all sort of related to this particular context. Our focus on this project was very much looking at what industry were doing in this space, so namely manufacturers and operators, to supplement some of the work that Catapult had already done around kind of user requirements and challenges. A couple of things to note on the scope of this project. It was quite broad in terms of how we defined micromobility, so that did include both private and shared micromobility, and also then in terms of how we defined accessibility and inclusivity. So for accessibility, that was very much considering, you know, from the disability vantage point, so be that individuals who identify as having physical, visual, non-visible or other disabilities. And then the inclusivity angle was just really, well, how can micromobility be as open and welcoming to as many different demographics as possible? So quite a broad scope all in all there. So what was the context of this project? There were various factors. I think that first and foremost, there's been the overall kind of massive growth of the micro mobility sector in the past few years, but particularly within that, the shared micro mobility sector. And obviously we've seen the rise of free floating tech-based startup companies, be that Dot, Boy, Lime, Tier, etc. And then within that, the prevalence of e-scooters. But I think the backdrop to this kind of rapid rise is that the majority, not all, but the majority of these vehicles associated with these services tend to be designed for non-disabled individuals, and they do not tend to cater for those with either physical or hidden or other disabilities. And I think when you sort of consider the backdrop to that, and that, for example, the charity Scope identify that, you know, around 20 to 22% of the UK population identifies having some form of disability, there's clearly a bit of a disconnect there, and not a sort of very proportionate representation of our society in terms of what these vehicles can offer. But that's not to say that there's lots of exciting and interesting technologies and innovations coming to market, and that's almost in a way what our study sought to do, is to provide a bit of order and clarity around that. So our report itself had three broad themes which we sought to best capture the innovations and technologies in the market, and these were innovations in the design of the vehicles themselves, innovations associated with sort of infrastructure and parking, and innovation in sort of micro-mobility service operations. And so for today's presentation, I'm just going to bring out a handful of examples from each of those three themes. And given sort of relevance of today's topic, but also time constraints, I'm just going to focus on shared micromobility because the report itself is over 100 pages long. So I'd probably be here all day if I went through everything. So please do not take what I show you as kind of representative of everything in our report and indeed everything on the market itself. So the first theme of the research I'd like to touch on is around innovations in the design of micromobility vehicles. So in this context, vehicle design refers to the design of micromobility vehicles, be that component parts or the vehicle as a whole, which is basically helping address accessibility and usability. In terms of kind of three headlines of findings that were relevant to this section, I think one is that we're increasingly seeing wide-ranging vehicles being developed or introduced that help address accessibility. Two, the innovations in this space tend to range from bespoke vehicles, so vehicles specifically addressing a certain user type or need, so for example, adapted vehicles, to specific vehicle features that might help in the round with sort of accessibility, inclusivity concerns. So that could be lighting, that could be seat adaptations, that could be acoustic vehicle sounds. And then the third kind of headline from this theme is that I think a lot of the innovations in this space are being driven by the shared sector, particularly with the rise of e-scooters. And I think in part that stems from how there's just so much competition from these companies and they're trying to sort of win competitive tenders in cities. So this is one way that they can kind of be seen to be best in class and sort of differentiate their services from each other. And so just to give you a flavour of some shared micromobility examples relevant to this particular topic, I just want to talk to the three pictures that I've got on the bottom of the slide here. And so the first on the left is from the company Helbiz, and they are expanding their micromobility offer to individuals who are previously not able to use their devices. And that's through the provision of two different types here. So you've got motorised wheelchairs and sit-down e-scooters. So the vehicle on the left is their sit-down e-scooter prototype. And then on the right is a adaptation whereby any kind of manual wheelchair can basically attach to an e-scooter and convert it from a manual to a motorised vehicle with speeds up to 12 miles an hour. And this is something that was launched in Charlotte in North America with a view to being rolled out in other cities in due course. The second picture in the middle is from the micromobility operator Super Pedestrian. And this is a picture of their seat attachment for their shared e-scooters. And based on our engagement with them, we found actually that their data suggests when they introduced it in the US that their user base are more inclined to use this particular model compared to the conventional e-scooter. And I think that kind of talked to a few things. Was one, that the kind of seated e-scooter can provide that extra comfort, but also perhaps help those who you might struggle to stand or have balance issues for sort of longer journeys. And in turn, I think the overall experience can be enhanced, be that, you know, the smoothness of the ride or the ability to use things such as the signal turns. And the data also suggested that users were more inclined to do longer journeys as well. And then the third example, this is actually from a colleague of ours in America from his hometown in the city of Concord in Massachusetts. And this is just to show you an example, which is probably a bit more prevalent in the US, of bike share schemes which are starting to include adapted vehicles as part of their overall fleet composition. I think that's a sort of really positive trend that we're starting to see in North America, where you have different vehicle types that serve different user needs. So that was just very much a quick sort of flavour of different vehicle innovations in the shared micromobility space. As I said, I haven't even touched on cargo bikes, I haven't touched on private micromobility, so that's just a quick nod of some examples. The second theme is around micromobility infrastructure that supports responsible parking. So as a whole, this theme is more centered around shared micromobility, but not exclusively. And I think this particular theme tends to stem from perhaps the original concerns around these free floating micromobility schemes, where you saw vehicles, you know, blocking roads and pavements, and very much causing kind of accessibility concerns in that context. So when kind of looking for our sort of market scan for this, we were looking for solutions that were kind of seeking to mitigate that. And I think the kind of initial overriding solution that operators were sort of relying on was geofencing technology. But it's fairly well documented that that's had sort of enough locational inaccuracies. And so what we're starting to see is that being supplemented with things such as AI or camera-based technologies, which can kind of enhance that geofencing accuracy. But even with those new kind of technologies like AI, I think there's a growing recognition about the benefit that light touch infrastructure can provide in this regard, recognizing the consistency to both users and non-users that brings. And so in that context, I just wanted to show a couple of examples of light infrastructure examples that are helping address accessibility in this regard. So again, looking at the two pictures at the bottom, the first one is from a company called Qmute. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And they have a prototype of universal micromobility charging infrastructure, which basically can park and charge any type of vehicle, be that an e-scooter, an e-bike, or a wheelchair. And it can be kind of stored in one place. And there are other companies such as QI Managed Services who also offer this kind of dock, lock and charge product, which is, I think, a really great thing to be hopefully be seeing in more cities as well. But perhaps of greater relevance to this topic is the picture on the right. And that is the parking rack that Voi, the e-scooter company, have used for their trials in the UK. And this particular parking rack was designed in collaboration with the Royal National Institute of Blind People. And there are a few features within that specifically have accessibility within mind. So the panels that you can see with the parking P sign there, they on one hand were aimed to stop vehicles from falling over and blocking pavements, etc., and the kind of accessibility concerns that stem with that. They're also designed that an individual perhaps with a walking cane would then be able to easily identify what the parking rack is. And also the color contrast has been designed in such a way that it's more distinguishable and unique for those perhaps with visual impaired concerns. So again, just a couple of examples and not representative of everything, but hopefully that gives you a flavor. And then my final theme from the report is around innovation in micromobility service operations. So this really is all about any initiatives around education, training, user experience that have all been introduced to make accessibility and inclusivity is sort of enhanced overall. And this is about both encouraging existing users but also non-users at the same time. And there's a few examples here. So the first one, we're increasingly seeing user training campaigns or safety events being introduced. So for example, operators such as Voi and DOT are partnering with third-party organizations such as the AA to introduce accredited safety training. The second example, and perhaps talks to our previous two presentations around this digital kind of barrier, is it's not just about the vehicles themselves, but it's the whole package of how you access these services, be that the apps or the websites. And in that context, it's great to see some initiatives being developed. So again, a couple of examples is Bird and Voi, and they basically have the ability to adapt the interface, the content that is shown on their website based on an individual profile's needs. So for example, the content could be tweaked based on someone perhaps with cognitive disability issues, and then therefore that is more appropriate in that regard. And sort of building on that, the third example, again talking to this kind of digital barrier, is providing access to services without smartphones or credit cards. I think it's the particular stat, I think it varies, but anywhere between sort of 15 to 20% of the population in the UK don't have access to a smartphone. So it's important that there are initiatives that can kind of help overcome that. And one example here is the company Spin, who are now owned by TIER, and their Spin Access scheme, whereby individuals can access the vehicles through a text SMS-based service rather than through having to have a credit card or smartphone in the first place. And then the final example, and again, it kind of links to the digital element as well, is, well, firstly, smartphones can be expensive, but also more generally, particularly shared micromobility, cost can be seen as a barrier for uptake. So increasingly, we're seeing initiatives whereby there are kind of tariffs or particular campaigns that target low-income groups. For example, Lime Access with their particular initiative, or for example, TIER, who combined both cost and safety concerns into one package, whereby they have a safety pricing initiative whereby users are not charged when the vehicle is stationary. So lots happening in this space, and I think it's really positive that more and more things are being introduced to kind of both educate, improve, and overall make it a better user experience in this regard. And I'm rattling on here, but this is my last slide, conclusions or thoughts in this space. Yeah, there's lots of innovations across micromobility that are being introduced that make it more inclusive and accessible as a form of transport. What I would say, I think infrastructure is absolutely vital though, and I don't think emphasis should be entirely placed on industry and operators and manufacturers to kind of provide the solution in this regard. Adequate infrastructure, be that segregated cycle lanes or better road conditions, can go a long way to making this a more inclusive and accessible sector. When I talk about regulatory barriers, I think there are some existing barriers in the UK. I mean, the e-scooter situation at the moment is probably an obvious example of how certain vehicles are not being allowed to come to market. But for example, our stakeholder engagement work as part of this project, we spoke with some manufacturers who sort of alluded to the fact that, you know, for example, the e-bike regulation is perhaps, you know, inhibiting certain products from coming to market. So there's the speed assist, the pedal requirement, and the power limitations within the e-bike regulation. And some of the operators we spoke to said they were, you know, for example, including pedals more because they had to, but actually a throttle-based approach would be better. So I think it's just a more general point here of, can sort of existing and future regulation be a bit more flexible to allow great products to come to market, particularly if they have accessibility benefits in mind. In terms of tender requirements and funding, I sort of touched on a couple of examples in the US where sort of different vehicles are included in bike share schemes. And I think it'd be great in the UK if we could follow that lead and have a variety of vehicles that suit different user needs and types within our fleet. But obviously the immediate counter to that is one of the reasons why that's not the case in the UK is funding is a massive barrier. So perhaps that talks to a wider point about how can we unlock sort of central government funding or pull on other levers to help introduce more accessible vehicles in this context. And I think funding is a general point to this overall topic. Again, from the stakeholder engagement work, I spoke with some really interesting manufacturers who had some great products, but unfortunately funding wasn't allowing them to kind of scale it and pilot it and bring it to market. So again, are there kind of Innovate UK or central government funds that could help some of those interesting products come to market? And then stakeholder engagement, I think that is absolutely crucial, not just for micromobility, but across transport in general. How are you meant to know and understand accessibility and inclusivity needs if you don't actually engage with relevant individuals and groups in the first place? And I think particularly for micromobility, that's vital for kind of going forwards and how we progress this properly. And yeah, I think my penultimate point, just to say, lots of market examples I haven't covered today. So if you would like to sort of outside this conference speak on this topic, I'd be more than happy to. And just my last point, which hopefully will come up with some pictures, just in preparing these slides today, even looking at my LinkedIn feed over the past week, there's just stuff happening all the time in this space. So I do think the future is positive, but I think funding, infrastructure and regulatory support are vital for progress. So sorry, Alan, I know I went on a bit too long there, but that's the end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Ross. There's an awful lot in there to unpack. And I'm particularly interested in the variety of vehicles that you're developing and that you're looking at. And you're talking about the conflict between what we're trying to deliver and regulation. And if we're going to insist on driving license, as we currently are for the trials, many of the users of those, you know, the use cases are instantly excluded. So there's a lot to unpack in there. And I would like to emphasize your very good point about engaging with stakeholder groups. And the example of working with, I think you said, the RNIB over the scooter storage, and lived experience from whatever group is key to getting these things right. So yes, there's a lot to unpack in there. Hopefully we'll get some good questions some good questions at the end. And finally, but not least, Jess, if you would, you'd care to step up and share your experiences, and then we can open the floor to some questions.
I just need to unmute myself and then I will be happy to share my experiences. Hi everyone, my name is Jess Strangwood. I'm going to go in for the description. I'm a white mid-30s woman with a bicycle and a horse and cart behind me, because I made sure that my background was appropriate. But I'm from, I would like to talk about bike share, but also about how we increase sharing across all different groups, like lots of already have been covered today. And basically the title of this is Share and Share Alike, of, you know, bike share is for all, but are we really making sure that we are doing as much as possible in order to do that, and a lot of lessons that Nextbike have learned along the way. One thing to say is Nextbike has been purchased by Tier. So at the moment we're in a transition phase of being called Nextbike by Tier, but in the future will be Tier. So I'm getting used to sort of saying that I work for Tier at the moment. So please recognize that Nextbike and Tier are interchangeable organizations. So Nextbike has 7 schemes across the UK, and our 2 biggest schemes are in Glasgow and Cardiff. And I think our experience in Glasgow is the one that is kind of most interesting and successful currently. So we partner with a cycling charity called Bike for Good, who run a number of different initiatives to do with cycling. But there is one source of funding that they got through the Smarter Choices, Smarter Places, also through Glasgow Central and Population Health. There are also multiple other organisations that fund Bike for Good. And it was Como who originally kind of spearheaded this programme, which is known as Bike Share for All. And the aim of this programme is to try and make sure that every different group that is excluded from, might be excluded from bike share, might be excluded from cycling, is included. And for me, I think particularly with bike share, there could be a whole other panel on how we get people to cycle. So when you're talking about trying to encourage people into bike share, you have 2 challenges. You have, well, I need to get people onto a bike, as well as getting them to learn about how to use a bike share system. So the great thing about how Bike for Good run their scheme is that they provide a lot of support in order to try and get people from different groups cycling. So this is, my slide shows a poster kind of encouraging people to sign up for a Nextbike membership, and including they'll get free training, guidance and support. But there's also a list of all the different things that Bike for Good do in order to kind of like handhold people through the process, which is cycle training. So it is sometimes just teaching people to cycle for the first time, as well as we work with a lot of sort of newly arrived refugees in Glasgow, and also then learning how to navigate roads and some language issues, which I'll come on to a bit later. So we subsidise the memberships, so it's £3 for a year. And therefore they have a year's access to the Nextbike scheme. This excludes our electric bikes in Glasgow. That's only because our electric bikes are not included in any of our membership schemes, but that's slightly different in Cardiff, that they're on a pay-as-you-go subscription model, mainly due to the number of them in the city. So the main thing I would say about the Bike for Good model is how much energy and time and support you need in order to target particular groups in order to bring them to cycling in general. So this overall has become a kind of catch-all project known as social prescribing. So previously Nextbike did do a project of kind of GPs doing prescribing a bike share membership to people who were like usually taking a break from mental health issues. And so it was a way of like, well, here's a way that you can try and improve your exercise. But you can see from this, so this slide includes sort of aims of the project. So essentially like affordable transport, and as well as encouraging cycling for everyday journeys. But particularly the number of groups that it's trying, that the project reaches out to, is very wide. So deprived communities, refugees and asylum seekers, LGBTQ people, mental health organizations, and addiction recovery centers. So the Bike for Good really has a very wide group of people that they are reaching out to. And one of the things that I really enjoy about the project is one of the metrics that they try and explore or talk about is social inclusion and community, in terms of how, you know, bringing people together for a led ride brings them mental health benefits and welcomes people into community, as much as then encouraging them into cycling as well. So this we have this statistic of this year, sort of 300 people engaged, and we have over 200 memberships just this year, and then there'll also be people. This scheme has now been running for 6 years, so has really, you know, and has always had at least over 100 every year, and increasing year on year. And actually, I was just asked, it was good timing, I was just asked this morning by Alistair, who runs Bike for Good, if we can increase the program by another 500 memberships, because that is the number of people that they are hoping to reach out to. There's a new initiative that they're trying as well at the moment, which is to encourage people to cycle to football matches, particularly from disadvantaged and deprived communities, in conjunction with the local football clubs. So again, there's lots in Glasgow at the moment. There's lots of different activities around trying to find ways to get people on bikes. So I kind of put this as like Next Bike, and also bike share, everyone knows, is kind of a gateway drug to cycling in general, and you know, all forms of active transport. But I think one of the things that has been important for us to really think about as the project has gone on year in year is making sure that we're doing as much as possible to be accessible. And I just sorry, this is the advantage of going last as a speaker. I just grabbed the Spin Access tier to say that one of the biggest things, sorry, I grabbed an image from the previous speaker. I'm so sorry, I've forgotten your name right now. About ways that we try and make payment more inclusive. And Nextbike in general always has an option for people to use the bike that is not through your smartphone. In fact, like any RFID card can be kind of programmed to be able to use our bikes. And we found in general, you know, for most of our schemes, the majority of people are using their smartphones, but with this particular group, it was really clear that that was not going to work. So we provide membership cards. And the other thing is to make sure that we have the right visual aids. So sorry, this slide shows like lots of people on lead rides, lots of high vis looking very happy, and Glasgow very sunny, which is probably not quite the truth all the time, but also some instructions of how to use Nextbike, which are very kind of simply drawn, sort of depicts cartoons of how to use the bikes. But those kind of things actually are really important. And I would say, as an aside as well, of you know, the Nextbike is a German company, Tier is a German company, and one of the things I've realized recently is actually how you translate usage and how, you know, different communities respond to different levels of instructions. One of the things about Nextbike, I mean, this is just my personal opinion, is we put a phone number very clearly on the bike, and the number of calls from the UK far exceeds a lot of the calls from German schemes. So it's like, as a nation, also we're a nation of people who like want to call and want to speak to somebody. So I think, again, as the other speakers have alluded to, like, never discount how people like to communicate, even sort of our country, not, you know, not just from different groups. So yeah, we always make sure that we provide a way that people don't need to use a smartphone. And I'd say for that as well, it's easy to think that you know, we only do these things to benefit kind of groups who might not have access to a bank account, but we have plenty of people who say, oh, I like to go for a run and I don't want my phone with me. So I would like another way to hire the bike. And I think that's for me a lot of, when we're talking about inclusion, it always seems like, oh, we're doing it for like this one group, but or a, you know, a disabled group or something. But also we never know when we might move into that group, and essentially, you know, making sure that everything can be accessible, like helps everyone overall. That's probably a very obvious point, but I like thinking about it. So this next slide is a meme that I've created, and it's two muscly men doing a, what's it called? A fist. Everyone's on mute, so they can't help me. Two fists clasped together, and it says cycling charities, bike share operators, and the hands come together and they say bike share. So obviously, I believe that cycling charities and bike share operators are like the perfect match in order to deliver cycling programs. But I think the reason that I wanted to put this meme in here also is to show that cycling charities have a mission to support people getting into cycling, and bike share operators want to provide cycling for everyone. But how you get people into cycling and how bike share operators kind of go about their business can sometimes be at odds with each other. So it's like the perfect pairing, but it doesn't mean that it's always easy to do. So as I said earlier, we have a request to increase the number of memberships that we're giving out. But alongside that request was like, oh, can you do lots of bike drop-offs at certain locations so we can do led rides and cycle training? That, you know, that then brings as an, you know, operation, we're trying to make sure that our operations are there for the majority of our customers, so bikes are in the right place, and starting to do this is a small thing, but I just felt it was like an honest version of like how to be inclusive of, you know, it's difficult for us as a business then to try and like, you know, divert a van for a couple of hours in order to make that work. It's not insurmountable, there are ways around it, but it's something now that when I'm thinking about how we build projects with partners, we really think about some of those nuts and bolts things of like, oh, well, okay, it's not just enough to give the membership, and also bikes being in a particular place is important, and then how that also impacts on sort of the our general customers, because we know that if you know, I'm sure many of you have had the thing with bike share of like, oh, I can see a station and I can see loads of bikes are there, but if I look on my app, I can't use some of those bikes, and so if we leave bikes inactive, there can sometimes be the tension of that. So I really feel that our project with Bike for Good, because they are able to offer so much support, has been really successful and has continued to build. Also, the funding for cycling in Scotland at the moment is very good, and therefore that has helped the program grow. So kind of to continue on this, I wanted to move into a sort of discussions about inclusion that kind of come for me in quite a hard area. So last year we ended up having to shut down, pause our scheme in Cardiff because the vandalism had just got to a point where we were it was impossible for us to provide a good service. And we were very lucky that our council partner and OVO, our sponsor, really stuck with us, and we piled all the broken bikes in the centre of Cardiff to kind of show everyone what was happening. Sorry, the slide shows has various pictures of my amazing team in Cardiff, some pictures of some of our staff with the police doing patrol, also a picture of a big pile of broken bikes in front of Cardiff Castle, and lots of news articles about it. But one of the things that we had to do as part of this shutdown was close some stations in low income areas, in very deprived areas. The issue being the stations that we had there were very low performing and had very high vandalism. So anytime that we would put bikes there, they would be vandalized, which obviously would lead to it not being very well used because the bikes aren't there to be used. But this was a really, you know, for the council especially, this was a really tough decision, because the idea of bike sharing was that everyone should have access to it, particularly the people who need transport. So it was very difficult, and we tried to build capacity in other areas where we were having to close down stations, but it's still something that I don't have an answer to it, and I feel very sad about it in terms of like, I have another pet theory of the health of your bike share scheme can show the health of your city in some ways. And one of the things that we found in Cardiff was a lot of the vandalism was being done by young people. And there are lots, that's something, and as part of our process during the shutdown, we met with some groups, sort of NEETs groups, like Not Informal Education, to discuss with them about, what they knew about the bike share scheme and ways that they thought that we could protect it. And someone suggested that we have 24-hour security at all the stations, which I would absolutely love. And if any council would like to provide that would be great. But yeah, this was.
Don't want to cut you off, Jess. We are running out of time.
Okay, cool.
So
no worries. I have one more slide, and then that's me done.
Super.
Yeah. Oh no, sorry, that's a lie. But yeah, so I just wanted to say, I suppose an example of schemes where we were in the unfortunate position of having to cut down access in areas where it wasn't working. So anyway, I will end there. Thank you.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Jess.
No, don't worry. I put my timer on as well, so I'm sure I carried on and on.
There's been an awful lot of good content in there, but there's some good questions come through, and so I wanted to try and see whether we might be able to get to one or two of them and get some quick answers. One of the questions, I can leap straight into them. I don't know whether Antonia wants to step forward and put her question, or whether she wants me to put it for her.
Hi, yeah, happy to join in. I just wanted to kind of understand what any of the operators have been doing really in terms of helping to widen the demographics, particularly in terms of ethnicity, but perhaps also in terms of gender as well. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's a really good question. And who would like to grab that and lead with that?
I'm happy to start very briefly, if that's right.
Yeah.
So I think on DRT schemes, I mean, typically we work in partnership with local authorities. So they are, the DRT scheme will belong to the local authority, but we would normally work alongside them to promote the scheme, particularly in the very early days. I think change management when you're putting in a DRT scheme is really, really important. People are used to how a bus has always looked for many, many years. And a DRT is a bit different, and how to access it, how to get the best from it is a bit different. So I think we're very used to doing things like road shows to really, we've gone to many parish councils, things like that, to really get into local communities and make sure they're aware of the new service and make sure that, as I say, we are attracting as broad an audience as possible. So yeah, main responsibility lies with local authority, but lots of expertise we can bring and very used to going along and doing road shows alongside them. Alan, you're on mute.
Sorry, I've been doing the unmute thing. It had to happen. Rob, you're going to chip in.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm sort of replying to Antonia. I mean, we don't specifically target ethnic minority groups as such, mainly because we don't have any data sets that show that. But just looking at that map that I put up earlier of Newcastle, those two key areas where urban squeeze were located, on the right-hand side, it was a quite traditional community of social housing, biker, and on the other side, the West End, even though they are both urban squeeze, the West End, anyone who knows the area, is one of the most sort of diverse areas, with a Sikh temple, a couple of mosques, a Hindu temple, and a quite high level of East European people from the EU. And again, demand is rising in that area. We're actually expanding it, putting more cars into that area to meet that demand. So we don't specifically target groups, but by looking at things like social inclusion, we know we do actually pick up that as an issue. And in terms of work, we don't, although we don't overtly collect data on sex, because there's nothing in our membership that indicates if it's any gender. When we tried to do some basic analysis of our member database, it pretty much looks as if it's pretty evenly split between men and women. Where there is a very obvious imbalance with the sort of general wider community is older people. Even though older people would be ideally suited to car share in that they don't need to work, they don't need to do that commute, so they don't need a car for the day-to-day. We have a predominantly younger makeup, pretty much sub 35. And ideally, and we've tried areas where, you know, it's predominantly pensioners, that the socioeconomic mapping does identify housing types where you get large groups of pensioners, but it's never worked. And we need to, then I think there's some work we need to do there to overcome it, because I think as a group, they will be ideally suited to car share, but we haven't been able to attract them in so far.
And Ross or Jess, did you have anything you want to add? Or Jess?
Yeah, so we obviously, I went over Bike for Good, kind of tries to do as many groups as possible. In Cardiff, we have Women Connect, which is a Black and ethnic minority group. But one of the things I was going to say was that project is not as well funded and supported, and therefore has not been as successful as Glasgow. So yeah, those are kind of the way we reach out, is through partners, maybe not directly ourselves. Yeah.
Okay.
I'd just add from
Yeah.
a general point of gender. I think from our report, there's lots of initiatives from operators like Lime and Voy, who do campaigns or training events which are specifically targeted at rebalancing that sort of gender imbalance in e-scooters. And also you have things around vehicle design as well. So I know Voy, for example, introduced a hook on some of their vehicles because feedback was suggested that female users like to carry goods on the vehicle. So there's certain things that they're doing in that space. And then I think the more wider point about sort of unlocking the kind of gender imbalances, talking to the infrastructure point, be that a good density of parking and segregated infrastructure like cycle lanes as well.
Okay, super, thank you. And we're really running out of time, but I think hopefully we might, if we're quick, get a couple of quick questions in. There was one that I particularly wanted to ask that was common across a few of the presentations, which is, and Robert, you just touched on it, and people are reluctant to change their habits, and car owners stick with their cars. How do we encourage people to switch to these new modes of moving around? Somebody want to pick that up?
I have.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, my friend told me yesterday that someone at her allotment, they have introduced a low traffic neighbourhood in Tottenham, and he was like, "Oh, it's just so bad now. I'll have to walk." And I do think infrastructure and low traffic neighbourhoods is, you either don't do anything and make the city so congested that people realise they need to walk, or you force the issue. I think infrastructure is one of your most powerful tools, which I do think in general councils are coming onto. But yeah, heaven forbid removing car parking spaces, etc. Which
if I could pick up there, I would agree with that point from Jess. The areas where car share works best is where the pain points of car ownership are worst, are the highest. So if there are any charging, if there's parking issues, any high density housing with low parking numbers, if the parking ratio is right, then people will will give up car ownership and move to car share because it's more convenient, basically, than owning a car. So we have to, in some ways, if owning a car is more difficult, it's better to encourage shared transport.
I'm sure that's not what you're suggesting.
Also good public.
Making things worse seems to encourage them. Yes, I'm not sure any councillors that I know would adopt that as a policy. Ross or John, do you want to before we move on?
Just very, very quickly. I mean, I think part of the answer is providing good quality options. I think the car provides a very high bar for flexibility. So, you know, can public transport with a bus that will come twice a day really compete with that? It probably can't. But actually, if you can create an on-demand bus service that can actually take people where they want to go, when they want to go there, then that starts to bridge some of that gap. So I think high quality options is the only way to go.
Okay, super. And that leads me on, I guess, to one final question. I didn't see who put it in the chat, but I did see it. And it's really that if we're going to encourage infrastructure and patterns of behaviour are so intertwined, how do we encourage joined up working between operators, between manufacturers and particularly local authorities? Does anybody want to pick that up very briefly? Are there any good practices you have?
I would just sort of probably talk to one of the points on my last slide about stakeholder engagement. So I think that's absolutely fundamental, that the respective sectors talk to each other, be that specifically in the accessibility sector, for example, through use of equality impact assessments, or is it the role of, for example, combined or transport authorities in trying to provide some coordination? So that would just be my quick kind of thoughts, but given time, I'll pass for others to chip in there.
Okay, that's super, thank you. And any other suggestions, particularly engaging with operators? Yes?
I thought I had a point, but I think the goal is to try and make see all the transport options as equal, which selling that idea is the difficult one. And so that's my thought. I don't have much more than that, but in terms of trying to get people to realize that all the different transport forms are more equal, and no, I don't have anything specific which I think would be helpful, but something there.
Okay, super, thank you. Finally, I see Dave in Glasgow has got a hand up.
Thanks, Alan. It's a point that I've been making for many years. We now buy our utilities, gas, electric and such like, from one supplier with a monthly bill. We buy our telecommunications, mobile phone, landline from one supplier. In fact, we can buy mobile phone, landline and utilities from some suppliers with a monthly bill. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't be buying transport in exactly the same way. We simply find a supplier who will offer us a monthly bill for bulk purchase of bus fares, and very much like Martin Gilbert launched or relaunched in Newcastle, because don't forget, Peter Huntley attempted to launch this 10 years earlier with Go North East with the key card, using the key card to hire scratch bikes when they existed in Newcastle and co-wheels. So it's not impossible. It's just trying to get people's mindset wrapped around the idea that you buy transport, as I have for the past 46 years, as journeys. And I choose whichever mode of transport works best.
I think that's a really interesting proposition. Clearly, if you've been doing this for that many years, you're ahead of the curve.
My motoring costs, Alan, in the tax year that sort of fell into COVID was about £200 for 2 years driving new electric cars all the time anyway, because Co-Wheels and Enterprise had electric cars available where I wanted to have a car. And so I just dropped off the train. I dropped off the train at Woking, nipped round the corner, jumped in the car and drove over to Send. And then I got back in the car and drove it back to Woking. It cost me, what, 12 quid, as opposed to thousands of pounds a year.
I think talking about some of the mobility options that we've been talking about this afternoon opens up the opportunities for that kind of service. Vastly beyond just cars and trains.
I'm very interested in what Robert was doing with 2 station locations for some vehicles, because I think Huntley, where Co-Wheels is still involved, could have a place for the car at the Huntley station and a place for the car at Huntley Village, and the local people who are using the scheme would work out where best to leave the car. To be able to drive to the station or pick it up at the station when they come in on the train. That's so much
super.
could be done.
That's super, thank you. I think that's a very interesting point to end on. I'm afraid we have run out of time. Can I just thank John, Robert, Ross and Jess for their contributions this afternoon. Hopefully it's been stimulating. And there are opportunities to go away and perhaps work together to find the future where we end up this time next year or indeed in 5 years. Can I remind everybody that the next session starts at 3:15, and that's on what shared transport and rail can do for each other. But I'd just like to wind up. Thank you all for attending. I hope it's been worthwhile, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.